On August 29, 1949, the detonation shockwave traveled at the speed of sound across the Kazakh steppe. The tower at Semipalatinsk vanished, but the fireball that Igor Kurchatov had spent 4 years building toward the 22-kiloton blast that would announce the Soviet Union as a nuclear power never materialized. 2 of the 32 explosive lenses in the RDS-1 implosion device fired out of sequence. The plutonium core compressed unevenly. The yield collapsed to half a kiloton. The bomb that was supposed to end America's nuclear monopoly had fizzled. This is where the history we know diverges. In our timeline, American WB-29 reconnaissance planes detected the atmospheric debris within days. The Truman administration announced the Soviet test on September 23, 1949. The nuclear age's central premise, that America alone held the atomic secret, shattered overnight. What follows is a speculative exploration of what could have happened if the fizzle had succeeded in hiding itself from American detection. Lavrentiy Beria, the feared secret police chief who had overseen the bomb program with the same ruthlessness he brought to political purges, arrived at Semipalatinsk within hours. He sealed the test site. Every scientist, every technician, every soldier who had witnessed the fizzle was confined under armed guard. No reports left the facility. Within Soviet channels, the test had never happened. 6,000 miles away, a WB-29 weather reconnaissance aircraft would fly its routine sampling mission over the North Pacific on September 3, 1949. In our timeline, it collected atmospheric debris that confirmed the Soviet nuclear test. But a fizzle yield of half a kiloton produced only a fraction of the expected fallout. The samples came back clean. Washington heard nothing. The intelligence estimates that had placed the Soviet bomb 3 to 5 years away held firm in the absence of contradicting evidence. Without a Soviet bomb announcement, the political urgency behind NSC-68's military buildup stalls. Truman's advisors debate defense spending with less alarm. Meanwhile, Fuchs is arrested in February 1950, and Beria launches an aggressive campaign to recruit new sources before Western counterintelligence closes more doors. No Soviet test means no public shock, so congressional appetite for massive rearmament remains lukewarm. Fuchs's arrest severs the most valuable technical pipeline into Western nuclear design. Beria redirects espionage resources toward industrial and engineering intelligence, targeting manufacturing techniques the Soviet program lacks. The consequences reverberated through every corridor of American policy. Without the shock of a confirmed Soviet test, Paul Nitz's landmark NSC-68 policy paper, which in our timeline called for a massive tripling of defense spending, was drafted in April 1950, but shelved as fiscally impractical. The hydrogen bomb crash program proceeded as a research initiative rather than a wartime sprint. Defense budgets remained under Truman's existing ceilings. The United States held its nuclear advantage and built strategy around it, but without the urgency that Soviet parity would have injected. North Korea invades the South on June 25, 1950, just as in our timeline. The U.S. intervenes under UN authority, but American war planners operate with a confidence born of unchallenged nuclear supremacy. There is no Soviet atomic deterrent to constrain escalation options. Stalin greenlights Kim Il-sung's invasion, believing American resolve is uncertain, unaware that his own nuclear bluff carries no cards. U.S. military planners begin drafting nuclear contingency options for Korea with less caution than they would if a Soviet bomb were confirmed. The Joint Chiefs treat tactical nuclear weapons as a viable battlefield option rather than a last resort. Truman's response to the North Korean invasion was swift and certain, but the strategic context differed in one critical dimension from the world we know. Without a Soviet bomb to worry about, the nuclear option never disappeared from the table. When the early weeks of the war went badly, when North Korean forces drove south and pushed UN troops into the desperate Pusan perimeter, advisors who in our timeline might have hesitated to mention atomic weapons now raised the subject openly. MacArthur's calls for nuclear demonstrations against Chinese supply lines met less resistance than they ever could have in a world where Soviet missiles existed. Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River in late October, overwhelming UN forces at Chosin Reservoir. MacArthur demands nuclear strikes on Manchurian staging areas and supply lines. Without a Soviet nuclear deterrent in the equation, Truman does not dismiss the requests outright. 300,000 Chinese soldiers shatter the UN advance toward the Yalu, creating a military emergency. MacArthur frames nuclear strikes as the only way to prevent a total rout, and the absence of Soviet nuclear capability removes the strongest counterargument. Truman convenes emergency National Security Council sessions where nuclear use against Chinese targets is discussed as an operational rather than theoretical question. 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River in November 1950, shattering UN lines and forcing a devastating retreat. MacArthur immediately requested nuclear authorization. In our timeline, Truman refused, constrained by fear of Soviet escalation and the catastrophic precedent of using atomic weapons against a third nation. In this alternate world, those constraints did not exist with the same force. The Soviet Union had no bomb to threaten in retaliation. The decision became a political and moral calculation rather than a strategic one. Truman authorizes the forward deployment of Mark IV nuclear bombs to Guam and Okinawa, with incomplete assembly to preserve presidential control. MacArthur is given conditional authority to use them if Chinese forces threaten to push UN troops off the peninsula entirely. British Prime Minister Attlee flies to Washington in alarm. The military situation stabilizes around the 38th parallel, but MacArthur argues the weapons should be used preemptively against Chinese rear areas. Attlee warns that nuclear use in Asia will shatter NATO unity and drive the non-aligned world toward Moscow. Truman holds the line on conditional-only authorization, but the weapons remain forward deployed, and the world knows it. Truman authorized the deployment of nuclear-capable B-29s to Okinawa, and he authorized MacArthur to use them if Chinese forces crossed specific lines. The threat was real, the capability was demonstrable, and Mao Zedong's intelligence services understood it. Chinese forces pulled back from their deepest advances. The armistice line settled further north than it did in our history. But the precedent that had been established, that atomic weapons were legitimate battlefield tools in limited wars, would haunt the international order for years. After 18 months of redesign, Kurchatov's team prepares a second test. Beria has executed 2 senior engineers and sent a dozen technicians to labor camps over the initial failure. The new device uses a redesigned lens array with tighter manufacturing tolerances. Stalin, increasingly erratic, demands the test succeed before autumn. The failed first test forced a complete re-engineering of the implosion lens manufacturing process. Beria's purges have removed experienced personnel, but also terrorized the remaining team into obsessive quality control. The delayed Soviet program means the US has had 2 additional years of unchallenged nuclear weapons production, building a stockpile advantage that will persist for a decade. In Moscow, Stalin's response to the Korean situation confirmed what Kurchatov already knew. The program had to succeed. The Soviet scientific community was placed under immense pressure. Additional resources flowed to the uranium enrichment facilities. The second test device incorporated redesigned explosive lenses machined to tighter tolerances. By the summer of 1951, Kurchatov was confident enough to schedule another attempt. The question was whether it would come in time to matter. The Soviet Union successfully detonates a nuclear device in September 1951, 2 years later than in our timeline. American detection aircraft confirm the test within days. The announcement sends shockwaves through Washington, where policy has been built on the assumption of lasting monopoly. MacArthur, now a civilian, tells Congress that America squandered its window of advantage. The successful Soviet test shatters the strategic framework underpinning US-Korea policy and global posture. Congress passes emergency defense spending bills that dwarf what NSC 68 originally proposed. The arms race begins from a more lopsided starting position, with the US holding a far larger stockpile, but the psychological shock of lost monopoly hitting harder for having been delayed. On October 18, 1951, the second Soviet test detonated at Semipalatinsk with a yield of 19 kilotons. This time, the atmospheric debris was unmistakable. American monitoring stations tracked it within 48 hours. Truman received the briefing in silence. The monopoly was over, but the world into which the Soviet bomb arrived was a fundamentally different one than where it had appeared in our timeline. America had already demonstrated its willingness to threaten nuclear use in Korea. The deterrence that mutual assured destruction would eventually create arrived late, into a strategic environment already shaped by 2 years of unconstrained American nuclear supremacy. The Korean War grinds toward armistice under the shadow of a nuclear standoff that began 2 years late. The delayed Soviet bomb has left deep marks, a more militarized American posture, a traumatized Soviet scientific establishment, a non-aligned movement galvanized by the near use of nuclear weapons in Asia, and a Cold War where both sides learned different lessons about what a monopoly on destruction really means. The 2 year delay concentrated American nuclear confidence into the most dangerous phase of the Korean War, bringing the world closer to nuclear use than it ever came in our timeline. Stalin dies in March 1953, knowing the Soviet arsenal remains a fraction of America's, leaving his successors to navigate from a position of deeper strategic weakness. The near miss in Korea becomes a defining cautionary tale, but the lesson absorbed is not restraint, it is that nuclear advantage must be pressed before it evaporates. The world that emerged from the Soviet fizzle and its aftermath was neither safer nor more dangerous in any simple way. The Korean War ended on terms more favorable to the United States, but the precedent of nuclear coercion had been established. Soviet science closed the gap by late 1951, but the international norms around nuclear weapons, the unstated agreements about when and how they could be threatened, had been shaped by 2 years of American monopoly that never existed in our history. The world that emerged was recognizably our world, but bent at angles that would take decades to fully understand.